Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw, and now his latest book, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfit, and the Art of Battling Giants. He's been named one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine and one of the foreign policy's top global thinkers. He has explored how ideas spread in The Tipping Point, decision-making in Blink, and the roots of success in Outliers. With his latest book, David and Goliath, he examines our understanding of the advantages of disadvantages, arguing that we have underestimated the value of adversity and overestimated the value of privilege. He's been a staff writer for New Yorker since 1996. He's won a National Magazine Award and has been honored by the American Psychology Society and the American Sociology Society. He was previously a reporter for the Washington Post. Malcolm is an extraordinary speaker, always on target, aware of context and the concerns of the audience. He's informative, practical, poised, eloquent, and warm and funny. He has an unsurpassed ability to be both entertaining and challenging. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. That was a very nice introduction. It was, if you're curious, it was written by my mother. That's why it's so effusive. I'm incredibly thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I come from a family of educators. My brother is a principal. My father was a teacher. Both my grandparents were teachers, so I feel like I'm representing the Gladwell family here today, so I appreciate the opportunity. What I thought I would do this afternoon is to give you an argument for describing to the world what you do. Because I think, and for reasons I'm going to explain, I think that being able to make the case for what you do has never been more important than now. So I thought I would try and give you a simple and clear way of letting the world know why the world of community colleges is important. More than important, is actually crucial to the future of our society. And I thought I'd do that by going on a little bit of a tangent. I happen to really like tangents. And tell you a story about my mother. So my mother was born in Jamaica, in a little tiny house in the middle of nowhere, and off into the hills in the middle of the island. And her parents, both her parents, were teachers. They taught in the little one-room schoolhouse next to the little cottage where she grew up. And it was the greatest ambition for my grandparents that my mother and her twin sister go to college. Now, the reason that was an ambition and not a sure thing was that in Jamaica in that era, I'm not going to tell you how long ago this was because my mother really wouldn't want me telling you how old she is, but in Jamaica back in this era, public school only went to the age of 12. And after that, if you wanted to continue your education, you had to go to a private school. And there were a handful, about half a dozen of these private schools around the island, but they were primarily schools for the daughters and sons of the wealthy English white aristocracy of the island, the merchants, the politicians, the business people, the landowners. They weren't for the dark-skinned children of public school teachers in the middle of the island. In fact, the tuition for these schools was so high that for my grandfather just to send one of his daughters to school for 1 year would have been greater than his salary. And he had 2 daughters, so he had a problem. So what did he do? Well, he did what you do in those situations. He and my grandmother prayed and decided to go ahead with their plan. And they found a school called St. Hilda's where they thought would be a good match for their daughters. And they applied to this school, and my mother and her sister passed the exam, and my grandparents bought bus fare and the uniforms for the school, which is all that they could afford. And they just hoped that something worked out. And sure enough, just before the school year started, a scholarship was instituted by the government of Jamaica called the Island Scholarship, which was given every year to the most deserving public school child in the island. And my aunt wins that scholarship, so she's in. And then just before the school year starts, a local church scholarship opened up, and so my mother was able to go. And because of those two scholarships, my mother and her sister were able to go and get a high school education. And because my mother got a high school education, she was able to go to college. And because she went to college, she met my father. And because she met my father, I'm here today. Now, I told that story in my book, Outliers, and I intended that story as an example of how much serendipity and good luck goes into success. We tell stories about success and we assume that people who get ahead, it's all because of their own effort, and we forget, no, in fact, good luck plays a huge role, and your parents play a huge role, and society plays a huge role. But there's another way to tell that story, and that's what I want to dwell on this afternoon. And that's to tell that story from a statistical perspective. So I asked my mother this. I was asking her about this episode in her life, and I said, what were the statistical chances that someone in your position, a schoolgirl in Jamaica in the 1940s, would get a chance to go to college? So she said, all right, well, let's do the math. At the time, Jamaica was a country of 1.5 million people. So let's assume that 5,000 students were graduating from public school every year at the age of 12. There was one scholarship available to a private high school for those 5,000 students, right? So 1 in 5,000. But wait a minute, that's obviously an exaggeration. Some of those students would have found other scholarships, and a handful of the native Jamaicans in that pool would have had parents who could afford to send their kid to a private school. So let's say it's 1 in 500 is the odds of someone being able to go and get a high school education in Jamaica in that era, right? Now, that's just high school. We haven't talked about college yet. The way that high school worked in Jamaica back then is that it went for 4 years, but in order to qualify to go to a university, you had to take an additional year. You had to study for an additional year. My mother and her sister's scholarship did not cover that additional year. In order to get the money for that extra year of studying, my grandfather had to go and get an act of parliament passed, authorizing an additional year of funding for his daughters, right? And then after you had that year, you had to get to college. There's no colleges in Jamaica in that era. If you wanted to go to college, you had to go to either America or, as was the case for most Jamaicans, England, right? Well, if you thought that high school was an impossible expense for my grandfather, college in England was an even greater expense. I mean, you had to get there, first of all, and then tuition was vastly greater than high school tuition. So what were they going to do? Well, they went back and prayed again. And turns out there's another scholarship called the Commonwealth Scholarship, and my aunt wins that scholarship. You can see a pattern is emerging here about the differences between my mother and her sister. And my aunt cuts her scholarship in half, gives the other half to my mother, and then my grandmother goes and borrows the balance from the Chinese grocer who lived down the road. And we don't know how much it was, but it must have been a vast sum of money. And then when my mother got to London, where she and her sister were going to University College London, my mother got a job in a garment factory in the East End, right? So now think about all the things that have to happen if you're a Jamaican girl in the 1940s and you want to get a college education. You got to have a brilliant sister, a generous, brilliant sister. You got to have a mom who can talk the Chinese grocer into lending her an enormous sum of money. You got to be able to get a job. Someone in the East End's got to hire you. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There were so few people like my mother and her sister from the West Indies or Africa or anywhere in the world at University College London in the late 1940s and 1950s that my mother tells me that she once went to a party that was given by a very wealthy aristocratic benefactor of University College for all the overseas students. And while she was at the party, the hostess of the party came up to my mother and ran her hand across my mother's cheek. My mother said, "What did you do that for?" And the lady said, the woman said, "I wanted to see whether it came off." Meaning she wanted to know whether my mother's black skin would come off on her hand. She'd never met a black person before, right? That's how rare it was for black people to go to college in England in that era, right? So what are the statistical chances that a public school student in Jamaica in that era could get to university? I mean, they're incredibly small. They're not 1 in 500. They're not even 1 in 5,000. They're probably zero with a margin of error plus or minus 1%, right? Now, it turns out there is a name for that number. Economists have come up with a term to describe the percent of people in any given situation who have the ability to make the most of their potential. That's called the capitalization rate, right? The capitalization rate refers to the percentage of people in any situation who make the most of what they've been given, who have the opportunity to do that. And one of the things that you discover when you look at capitalization rates, not just around America, but also around the world, is that in one situation after another, they are always lower than you think. In other words, as human beings, we do a much worse job of helping people reach their potential than we think we're doing. So there's a brilliant example of this in, I don't know if you've read Michael Lewis's book, The Blind Side, which is this incredibly moving story about a kid, a young boy from the slums of Memphis, who is adopted by a wealthy white family. And it's a story of what happens to this boy over the course of his adolescence. And his name is Michael Orr, and of course he goes on, those of you who are football fans will know that he was an extraordinarily gifted football player. He goes on to play left tackle for the Baltimore Ravens. But there's a moment in the book when Michael Lewis is talking to Michael Orr, and he's talking about the neighborhood he came from. And he said, you know, how many great football players were there in that neighborhood? And Michael Orr says, if everyone in my neighborhood who could play football had the chance to play football, they'd need 2 NFLs. What he meant was the capitalization rate for football talent in my neighborhood was really low, right? And Lewis hears this and he thinks that's really interesting. And so he goes and he calls the school district where Michael Orr came from. And he said, do you know how many students every year in your school district get a scholarship to play football? And they said, yeah, we know. And they said, well, how many of those scholarship students actually take the scholarship, actually attend the college that offered them a scholarship? And you know what the number was? 1 in 6. The capitalization rate for football talent in Michael Orr's neighborhood in Memphis was 16%. Now, think about that for a moment. Football is something that we care passionately about in this country. There's almost nothing we care more about than football in this country. We spend an enormous sum of money in this country finding and developing football talent, right? So even if in the case of this one area, the thing that we care almost more about than anything else, we're only getting 1 out of 6 potentially talented football players out of this place in Memphis. If our capitalization rate for football talent is that low, then how low must it be for the things that we don't care that much about, right? So why are capitalization rates so low? Why do we do a bad job of developing talent, right? Of finding and developing the talent that's in front of us? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Couple of assumptions, I think, that have the effect of making us squander human potential in our society. The first is that I think we carry around in our heads the idea that talent is scarce, that there simply isn't a lot of it out there, right? That's why the British, when they were in Jamaica and they were coming up with scholarships, when I said that my aunt got the island scholarship that allowed her to go to high school, the British had one scholarship available every year for the entire island, right? For a deserving child to go to high school. Why did they only make one scholarship available? Right? Because they thought there was only one deserving student every year. Never occurred to them that there'd be a large number of talented, academically promising kids out there in Jamaica who could benefit from a high school education. They figured probably just one of them. We can just get away with one scholarship. Now you can look at that and you can say, well, the British must have been prejudiced. That's probably why they had that understanding. But I don't know if it's any different today. You know, for the last 20 years or so, many of the elite colleges in this country have had a program in place that says if you are a high school graduate and you come from the lowest economic decile, you come from the poorest section of America, and you score above 90th percentile on your SATs, we'll let you in for free, right? Come on in, and so they've tried to find, in other words, the most academically promising, economically disadvantaged kids in the country and make it easy for them to attend college, right? So how many students do you think fit in this category in last year's Harvard freshman class? The answer is around 20. Out of a class of 1,600, they found 20 promising kids from the poorest section of the American population. That's not a lot, right? And if you go on around to all the selective colleges in this country and ask them for what that number is, they'll give you a number that's right around 15 or 20. And then if you ask them how come you only have 15 kids who fall into that, or 20 kids who fall into that category? They'll tell you, well, there just aren't a lot of them. We look, we don't find a lot. So a couple years ago, a couple of economists decided they would fact check that. They would see whether it was true. Is it true that there aren't a lot of kids from very poor families in this country who are very academically promising? So they got the standardized test score database and they overlaid it on the census database, and they identified how many kids there were in this country who come from very poor families and who score in the 90th percentile above on the SAT test. You know what the number was every year? A number of high school graduates who fit in that category? 35,000. And when you break down that 35,000, you know what you discover? That only 15,000 of them even so much as apply to a selective college. There are 20,000 of these brilliant kids from poor families who aren't even getting close to the kind of institution that would allow them to make the most of their abilities, right? So this whole argument that the admissions officers from all these fancy schools give, that there just aren't a lot of students out there who fit into this category, isn't true. It's false, right? Now, why can't they find them? Well, they're clearly not looking in the right places. I mean, in the report the economists give, they said the reason these kids aren't being found is that the big schools will come in and they'll go to the big cities and look at the magnet schools and look at the graduates of those magnet schools, but they're not going to where these kids are, which is, they're in Appalachia, they're in the countryside, they're in rural high schools no one's heard of, right? They're not looking hard enough. Well, why aren't they looking hard enough? Because they have it in the back of their head that talent is scarce. They have the same assumption that I think many of us have, that if the number of people out there who are good at any given thing is going to be small. Right? And when you carry around that assumption in the back of your head, what happens? You squander talent. You leave human potential on the table. Second reason that I think our capitalization rates are low, and that is I think we carry around an assumption, a false assumption, that talent is innate, that Talent's out there, and you don't have to do much. The talent will just rise to the surface, right? That's what it means to be talented. You can just, on the strength of your own natural ability, make it in the world. Well, that's not true either. I spent a lot of time on this notion in my book, Outliers. And in particular, I was quite fascinated by this notion called the 10,000-hour rule, which is an idea that's been developed by psychologists over the years to describe what it takes to be good at something complicated. And the observation is, if you look at something that is cognitively complex, what you discover is that no one gets to be good unless they put in at least 10,000 hours of work first, right? In other words, having all the natural talent in the world is not enough. You have to have talent plus a big chunk of hard work, 10,000 hours worth of hard work. So if you look at chess players, for example, we know that anyone who's playing chess at an international level is really, really, really smart, right? But you won't find anyone at the international grandmaster level of chess who hasn't played chess for at least 10 years or 10,000 hours. Right? Doesn't happen. Can't be a great chess player even if you're the most brilliant person in the world unless you put the time and effort in. Same thing as a famous study done of classical music composers, where the psychologist who did the study made a list of the greatest classical music compositions of all time. And then he asked the question, at the time that piece of music was composed, how many years had the composer been composing? And the answer was, in every case, the composer had been composing for at least 10 years. There is no such thing as a great piece of classical music written by someone who just started composing classical music. Now, people hear that sometimes and they say, what about Mozart? Wasn't he composing music when he was 6 years old? And the answer was, yes, he was. But have you ever listened to the music, Mozart? Wasn't any good. First great piece of music, truly transcendent piece of music that Mozart composes is Concerto No. 9, 271, which he does when he was 23 years old, at which point he has been composing for 17 years. Mozart was a late bloomer, right? Don't let anyone ever call him a prodigy. What those examples remind us, I think, is all of the kind of support that has to happen, has to be in place for someone to be good at something. People don't get good on their own. They don't get good naturally. They get good because there are people around them who give them the time and support that allows them to practice, who give them encouragement, who give them resources, who do all the things that make it possible to put in that huge chunk of time necessary to make the most of their potential. You know, I was thinking about this recently. I was talking to a friend of mine who's heavily into music, and we were talking about the band Fleetwood Mac. Some of you are old enough to remember. Apparently lots of you are old enough to remember. And he asked me this really simple question. He was like, what's their best album? And I said, it's Rumors. He goes, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most important albums ever. Maybe it's the 4th or 5th best-selling album of all time. And then he said, what number album do you think that is in their discography, in their history? And I said, well, I know they had a self-titled album called Fleetwood Mac, and I know they were in England for a while, so I'm going to say it was their 3rd album. And he said, wrong. It was their 16th album. That band was around for 10 years making album after album after album before they got to be good. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand that Rumors only happens because 15 albums came before it, right? Then you don't understand where musical genius comes from. And then he made a really interesting observation. He said, you know, people don't give their record company enough credit because they had a record company who stood by them for over those 10 years and 15 albums when they weren't any good, waiting for them to get good, helping them, giving them the support and nourishment and encouragement they need to become good. And then he said, you know, people don't do that anymore today. Today in the record industry, there's nobody who would sit by you for 15 albums waiting for you to get good. He said, and as a result, an awful lot of talent is being left on the table in that world, right? when we don't appreciate how much support is necessary for human potential to be unleashed, what happens? We squander human potential. Third reason, by the way, there's only 3 reasons. I know you might be getting worried that there's 7 or 21. No. It's just 3. This is the last one. We're in the home stretch. Just wanted to reassure you. You don't have to make it worse by applauding the fact that I say I'm in the home stretch and like half the group applauds. Has it really been that terrible? Third reason, I think we squander a lot of talent because we have a very narrow definition of what talent is. You know, I thought about this a lot when I was writing my last book, David and Goliath, and I spend a lot of time talking about this really fascinating fact that many of the greatest entrepreneurs are dyslexic. You know, one of the best studies of this looked at a very large sample of American entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, and found that at least a third of them had been diagnosed at one point in their life with some kind of serious learning disability. And by the way, when you look at that list of successful entrepreneurs, it's some of the biggest names you can imagine. Richard Branson, the guy who starts Virgin, Charles Schwab, who started the discount brokerage, John Chambers, the head of Cisco, Craig McCaw, the guy who really founds the cell phone business. I could go on. It's an astonishing lineup of people. And if you go and talk to those people, as I did when I was writing my book, what you discover is it's not a coincidence that if you talk to them, they'll tell you that they are who they are because of their dyslexia. And they'll give the explanation they give is really fascinating. Think about it. You're 6 years old, and you show up in first grade, and you are incapable of doing the thing that you're supposed to do in first and second grade, which is learn to read. You have one of 2 options or scenarios that can happen to you. One is that you fail, you drop out, and that is the case for all too many students with learning disabilities. But there are a small number of students who have an opposite approach, right? And instead of being defeated by their disability, they compensate for it. And what does compensation for dyslexia mean? Well, if you're going to get through school where you're required to read and write and you can't read and write, how do you get through school? Well, the first thing you do is you learn how to delegate. And I can't tell you how many of these successful dyslexic entrepreneurs, every single one of them told me the same story, which was, well, starting around first and second grade when things got really kind of perilous, I made friends with the smartest kid in the class, and that kid basically did my homework for the next 5 or 6 years. That's how you get through, right? Second thing, what do you do if you're going to get through? Well, you learn how to problem solve. Your life is one big problem, right? You can't do the thing you're supposed to do. How do you get through? Well, you get really good at solving problems. Third thing you get good at doing is you get really good at leadership, right? You've got to put together a team to get through school. If you can't put together a team and lead that team effectively, you're not going to graduate from high school, let alone college. So here you have a group of people who over the course of their entire school career are working on their delegation, leadership, and problem-solving abilities. And then they get out in the real world and they want to start a business, and all of a sudden they realize they've been practicing the 3 most important skills for an entrepreneur their whole life, right? Now, what's fascinating when I talked to all of these people who had this experience was every one of them also told me about how often they were discouraged along the way, about how the school system that they were a part of told them over and over again that they weren't going to make it. They weren't going to amount to anything. They should lower their expectations, right? At every turn they were told they were failures, that they weren't measuring up to the standards that students were supposed to measure up to, right? Which is crazy. Here were a group of people who were capable of extraordinary things, and the system they were a part of did not recognize that. And why didn't the system recognize it? Because the system had an incredibly narrow definition of what it meant to be talented. didn't understand that there is more than one way to be good and to get good. One way is to be really brilliant and know how to read and write from the get-go, but another way is not to be really brilliant and know how to read and write from the get-go, but to learn how to overcome that particular obstacle. You know, I thought of the same thing in, this is sort of a trivial example for those of you who are football fans. You know, there's this weird thing in football where, with quarterbacks, that it's incredibly difficult for teams do an incredibly bad job of drafting quarterbacks. It's really hard to know whether someone is going to be a good quarterback coming out of college. In fact, if you look at, there's been studies done by this of economists. If you look at, by the way, I promise this is getting somewhere. Just bear with me. And if you're not a football fan, just zone out for about 2 minutes and then I'll get back to you. But there's studies done on this, and they've shown that quarterbacks drafted in the first 50 positions in the draft basically perform slightly worse as pros than quarterbacks drafted in positions 50 through 150. That's crazy, right? The quarterbacks drafted at the top of the draft are the tallest, the strongest. They've won the most games in college. They have the best coaches. They've got the most accurate arms. They've won the most games. I read a study once that showed that the quarterbacks drafted in the first round are the best looking of all quarterbacks. These guys have every advantage in the world, right? Yet somehow they're not performing better than the quarterbacks who aren't as tall and strong, who haven't won as many games, who aren't as good looking, who didn't get as well coached in college. How can that be? Well, the answer is that there's more than one way to be good as a quarterback. One way is to have every talent in the world at your disposal. The other is to not have every talent and to be forced to develop ways of compensating for that. And maybe if you're not blessed with every bit of natural ability in the world, you learn how to be resilient, and you learn how to be a good leader, and you learn how to be courageous, and you learn really good judgment. And at the end of the day, having good judgment and being courageous and being a leader and being able to bounce back from adversity is a better predictor of what it means to be an effective quarterback than having every advantage under the sun. There's another great example of this, which is they give everyone drafted into the NFL, all quarterbacks have to take an IQ test, right? It's called the Wonderlic. Now, it's not the same as the one all of us took. It's for football players. It's a little easier, but same concept. And they give it to these players because they think that how well they do on the test is a good indication of how well they'll play as a quarterback in the NFL. And the idea is being a quarterback is really cognitively demanding. So it makes sense that you want to know what these players' IQ is, right? So what is the correlation between how well you do on the Wonderlic and how well you do as an NFL quarterback? Well, I'll give you a little flavor. I'm going to give you the names. These are the names of the 5 quarterbacks over the last 10 years who have scored the highest on the NFL's IQ test. Ready? Ryan Fitzpatrick, Greg McElroy, Jason Moss, Blaine Gabbert, and Drew Henson. Now, I'm going to compare that to the list of quarterbacks who have scored among the lowest. And these are guys who scored below 15 out of 48, I think is what it's out of. And you practically get that many for signing your name. So this is not, these guys did not do well on the test. Let's just be nice about it. All right, so these are the 5 guys with the least impressive scores. Randall Cunningham, Jim Kelly, Dan Marino, Terry Bradshaw, and Donovan McNabb. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about football, let me let you in on a secret. The 5 guys who scored really badly on that test are in every way superior to the 5 guys who aced it. In fact, the 5 guys who did really poorly are among the 5 greatest quarterbacks in the history of the game. Now, does that mean you don't have to be smart to be an NFL quarterback? No, of course it's good to be smart, always. But it says that there's more than one way to be good. right? That you can be someone who doesn't do well on an IQ test, but you can compensate in ways that allow you to be a really, really effective leader on the field for a football team, right? And if you have as your definition of what it means to be an effective NFL quarterback, someone who scores really well on an IQ test, you are going to leave a lot of talent on the table, right? You're going to draft Ryan Fitzpatrick, and you're going to pass over Dan Marino, right? And that's a mistake. I think we make these mistakes all the time. Right? I don't think we just do it in football or in some of the other examples I've given you. I think this is something that we do over and over and over again in our society. And I think it's happening in your world right now, right? This week I stumbled across this report. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it blew my mind. It was by a group called the Nexus Research Group, and it was prompted by President Obama's proposal in January to make tuition free in community colleges across this country. And what these Nexus guys, a good idea. What the people who did this report wanted to do was to calculate the levels of support that taxpayers give various kinds of higher educational institutions, right? So if you think about it, students get loans, colleges get grants of one kind or another, and colleges also get taxpayer subsidies. They don't pay property taxes, they don't pay income taxes on the money they make on their endowment. So what these guys wanted to do was to take a representative sample of American educational institutions and figure out what is the annual per student taxpayer subsidy for each of these institutions, right? So for example, in the state of New Jersey, the Essex Community College gets an annual per student taxpayer subsidy of $2,400, right? Rutgers University in the state of New Jersey gets an annual taxpayer subsidy of $9,000 per student, right? Princeton University in the state of New Jersey, one of the richest and most prestigious universities in the world, gets an annual per student taxpayer subsidy of $100,000 a year, right? Let's do Pennsylvania. Maybe that's just specific to New Jersey. Go to Pennsylvania, the average community college gets about $2,000 a year in taxpayer subsidies. Penn State gets per student about $10,000 per year in taxpayer subsidies. Penn in Philadelphia, one of the richest and most prestigious schools in the world, gets $48,000 a year in taxpayer subsidies. This is true in every state of the union, that the wealthiest schools are getting the greatest amount of public support, and the schools that aren't the wealthiest are getting the least. If you want an explanation of why the capitalization rate in this country is as low as it is, there's your explanation. We're spending all of our time and resources giving support to people who don't need support, right? The Nexus report made the recommendation that we ought to have an excise tax on endowments of greater than $500 million. And the schools that have more than $500 million in the bank should just pay a small amount every year on whatever income they get from their endowment, and that money ought to be used to support community colleges in this country. And when I read that, and all I can say to that is, hallelujah. Why? Because think about what you do. What is it that you do? You are in the capitalization business. You are all from institutions that do as much as any institutions in our country to raise our capitalization rate. You don't believe that talent is scarce? No. You throw your doors open to everyone. You don't think that talent is innate? No. You provide the kind of time and support that's necessary for people to make the most of their abilities. You don't have a narrow definition of talent? No. You represent a cross-section of this country in your schools and institutions. But you need You need to make that argument to the world. You need to stand up in front of the rest of American society and say, this is what we're about, right? And this is a really crucial thing that we're doing. You know, I know it's sometimes easy to get discouraged by the current political and social climate that we're in. Many of the institutions you're a part of are facing all kinds of cutbacks and difficulties at the moment. But I think it's important for all of you to remember one thing, and that is that there is nothing in society more important than a capitalization rate. It's more important than the GDP of this country. It's more important than how high economic growth was last year. It's more important than the new technologies we come out with every year, the fact that this phone is bigger than last year's phone or faster than last year's phone. It's more important than the fancy museums that we build. All those things will be forgotten eventually, right? But when future generations look back on this era, they're going to ask one question. They're going to say, how good a job did you do of making good use of the talents you had at your disposal? And everyone in this room ought to be able to answer that question with pride. Thank you.